Well, joining me now on the phone is Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi. He is the United States Representative from Schaumburg in the Northwest and Western Suburban Illinois 8th District. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, good morning, Rick. How are you?
I'm still suffering from a cold, unfortunately, from the state fair, and there's nothing lingers longer than a summer cold. But it's a good thing you're probably on the phone, so that way I can't give it to you. I wanted to talk to you about, first of all, as we've been talking about this morning, the actions of the president on Friday as everybody was kind of watching Hurricane Harvey hit the Texas coast. But one of these things is the issue of pardoning former Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And a lot of people having the question of, is this send a symbol, particularly in light of Robert Mueller's investigation?
It does. First of all, I think that I hope that we keep the people of Texas in our thoughts and prayers as they confront Hurricane Harvey, which I believe resulted in one fatality already. But with regard to Sheriff Arpaio, just to give your listeners a little bit of background, he unconstitutionally racially profiled people. In other words, he detained people based on the way they looked, whether they looked like Mexicans or Latinos, and detained and arrested them. And he did so even after being instructed by a federal court, not to do so. And when he continued, he was held in criminal contempt. And over the weekend, we learned a couple things. One is that the president apparently tried to interfere in the DOJ's prosecution of Sheriff Arpaio, which is a big problem. It continues a disturbing pattern of the president basically interfering in law enforcement's investigation of ongoing crimes or criminal activities of folks in his administration, and in this case of the sheriff. And then secondly, he issued a pardon outside of the pardon process completely. There's no consultation with DOJ, and also the sheriff showed no remorse for what he did. And so, I believe that this all the more highlights the need for increased transparency in the pardon process, especially in light of the Russia probe. I've introduced something called the Presidential Pardon Transparency Act, which basically corrects for a huge loophole that exists in the pardon process now, which is that the president can actually issue pardons in secret. And so we don't know if he's already done so to his colleagues or associates or family members in connection with the Russia investigation. I've called for public disclosure of any pardons that have been issued because any secret pardons could impede the ongoing investigation of that particular probe.
Well, and in many respects, too, there's the question of the preemptive pardon, which is kind of what Arpaio got because he had not been sentenced yet. I believe he was facing up to 6 months in federal confinement. But as you mentioned, there's the reports out now that he consulted with Attorney General Jeff Sessions asking if the Justice Department had to continue its prosecution of Arpaio. Sounds familiar, kind of the same kind of issues that were raised with then FBI Director Comey with Sessions himself about Mike Flynn.
Right, exactly. It's the same fact pattern. I will say this, that the president's actually bringing people together in condemning him. Many Republicans, I'm heartened to say, came out against what he did on Friday night with regard to the pardon process. I'm specifically thinking of Speaker Ryan, John McCain, and Jeff Flake, and others. And so I'm hoping that we can approach this in a bipartisan way. We can bring some reforms to the pardon process. And make sure that going forward, the president can't just exercise this pardon power willy-nilly without any checks on his power.
You mentioned about Speaker Ryan, certainly Senator McCain raising issues here. But, every time there is a controversial act by this very unconventional president, the question becomes, at what point and obviously you're a Democrat, but at what point do the Republicans start stepping away from this president?
I don't know, Rick. The one thing that I'll say is that the president appears to retain some strong support among Republicans, although I think that it's starting to erode. I think that among independents, his standing has gone down. But, here's the thing, Rick, which I really hope everybody urges their representatives to do, which is regardless of which side holds the presidency or occupies the White House, I think that we in Congress have to exercise our oversight power and do the right thing. And that's why I am glad that, for instance, after Charlottesville, and I'm glad you played that news clip where, the president clearly tried to equate the actions of those who were preaching hate with those who were opposing the hate preachers. Again, numerous voices on the other side came out in condemnation on the Republican side as well. But now, we have to follow up those words with actions and do the right thing in Congress.
And, I know that there were concerns about the Department of Justice under this administration and grant money flowing. We're going to talk a little later about the state legislation involving immigration and law enforcement in the state of Illinois, a bill that Governor Rauner is expected to sign tomorrow. But you have some of these questions about, grant monies from the federal government being withdrawn for things like because of immigration or because of concerns about, hate crimes.
Exactly. Congressman Danny Davis, and I wrote a letter last week to the Department of Homeland Security and others, essentially questioning why grants that were issued to groups that receive funding to combat white supremacism had that funding cut off only 1 month after a report came out from the FBI saying that white supremacism was on the rise. This was, in particular, there's one group called Life After Hate that's based here in Chicago in Congressman Davis's district that was doing tremendous good work on this particular issue in combating anti-Semitism, the rise of hate, the rise of prejudice. And why would we ever try to stem their activities? I'm concerned about this, and I think that now more than ever we need to do whatever we can to, basically counter the hate preachers, the neo-Nazis, the Klansmen, and others who, basically are, perpetrating what we see are hate crimes and indeed what's happened in Charlottesville.
What actually do you think are some of these factors that are leading to that the rise, kind of a renewal of the white supremacist movement? Is it the economy? Is it factors?
I don't know all the factors conclusively, Rick. That's why I've in part called for a bipartisan, independent national commission to study the rise in bigotry and prejudice and extremism and hate crimes and figure out solutions to it. But I do suspect that here are a couple factors. One, I do think that the rhetoric, starting with, tweets at the top to people who are affiliated with the alt-right movement, essentially are fanning the flames of prejudice. And I think that emboldens people who may have held feelings of bigotry or hatred or prejudice to now act upon them. And that is very disturbing. It's touching people across the spectrum and in an adverse way, obviously. And I'm hearing from it every day from my constituents, Rick. It's, whether it's Jewish groups who are basically telling me that they're getting an increase in calls threatening violence. These are to schools, elementary schools, Jewish elementary schools, JCC schools, to mosques that are telling me about vandalism and also the need to increase security, to Latino and Hindu and Sikh and for that matter, LGBTQ groups. So it's really across the board, and we have to put a stop to it, Rick. There's no place for hatred in America.
I just have to wonder if social media isn't a contributor in this as well.
I think so, and there is this. Unfortunately, on the social media, in social media circles, there's unfortunately some. The president accuses folks on the other side of the aisle for perpetrating fake news, or accuses the press of propagating fake news. But we are seeing in social media all kinds of theories being propagated that are clearly fake and that are meant to inflame tensions and relations between different people.
It's interesting times that we're living in. We're speaking with Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi, Democrat from Schaumburg. I'm Rick Pearson. This is the Sunday Spin. Welcome back to the Sunday Spin. I'm Rick Pearson of the Chicago Tribune here in the All-State Showcase studio in Tribune Tower on North Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. And joining me on the phone is Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi. And Congressman, we had a texter actually with a question, and I think I know the answer to this. Is they were basically asking, going back to the pardoning issue, whether accepting a pardon isn't that somewhat of an admission of guilt. And it's my understanding for civil purposes that it is considered an admission of guilt if in civil lawsuit cases. So just that's my understanding of the situation.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about social media, hate crime, this kind of thing. I know also that you've been looking at this issue of freedom of speech and the kind of the issue on college campuses where, and being a First Amendment advocate and a free speech advocate, it somewhat troubles me, despite some of my own views on some of these speakers, the fact that we're not using campuses to avail ourselves to all learn from even people we vehemently disagree with.
Yeah, in principle, I agree with that, Rick. We actually had a hearing recently in the Oversight Committee to talk about this issue. And, essentially what I believe is that, both, people, for instance, let's take the issue of the alt-right. There have been speakers from the alt-right who visited campuses. And, I think that especially in a private setting, private university campus setting, if they're invited and they are given a place to speak, I think that people should be given a place to peacefully protest against them as well. And in a state campus setting, I think that the protections for that type of speech are even greater because obviously you have a state actor, you have a government actor, and now the First Amendment really does squarely get addressed. At the end of the day, Rick, I think that in our country, we have to protect freedom of speech jealously, just like we protect the freedom of the press jealously, because that's how we hold government to account. That's how we make sure that, different minority groups are protected and that our country flourishes and what are considered to be radical ideas aren't squelched just because the people in power disagree with them. And I believe strongly in that.
Well, and I guess that's why, when we looked at President Trump's address in Phoenix, and he vilifies the press for half an hour and then says, I'm a strong protector of the Second Amendment. And it's like, there is a First Amendment, too. And, but I just wonder, though, we just seem so polarized and divided these days that, that's what actually people forget about what our rights are all about. And it's... Exactly.
I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think that the president is here to, he has to protect all the, parts of the Constitution that exist, regardless of whether he agrees or disagrees with them. I think that, He's obviously a strong proponent of the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. But the First Amendment is rich in protections that ensure that government is held accountable. And I'm concerned about the erosion of these rights. Now, if somebody engages in speech that would amount to a hate crime, that incites violence, so that basically targets people based on what they look like or their sexual orientation or threatens them in any way, that's a different story. That goes from speech to something
right. That takes it a step further.
Basically, yeah, that takes it a step further. But on the other hand, if they're engaging in more philosophical speech or speech that isn't inciting people to violence, I think you have to allow for that. It reminds me of that Skokie protest. You may remember when the Ku Klux Klan, I believe, or neo-Nazis, or both, came to Skokie, and they were virulently anti-Semitic. And as you know, Skokie has a large concentration of Jewish Americans. What I really admired is that, basically the authorities in Skokie, a gentleman delivered the notice to the Klansmen or neo-Nazis to be able to protest or to march, I should say, in the village of Skokie, and then he went over to the other side and started protesting his speech in a civil fashion, peaceful fashion. I think that is the ultimate, picture of what free speech in this country looks like.
I want to ask you quickly here about goings-on in D.C.
Yes,
we now have the president announcing in Phoenix that as part of trying to make sure that the debt limit's extended, that we have budget, that he's willing to shut down the federal government unless Democrats also support the U.S. paying for a border wall.
Yeah, I'm not going to support building a border wall. I think that, the president should present a clean bill, so to speak, on raising the debt ceiling. And we need a spending plan, by the way, as well. We have to do this in a bipartisan way, Rick. What often happens in Washington, D.C. is that certain folks will not vote for any federal spending under any circumstances. And some of them are members of the Freedom Caucus. And so what ends up happening is that the speaker relies on Democratic votes to raise the debt ceiling and to come up with a spending plan, a rational spending plan. And so, if that is going to be the case, and I suspect it is, then it needs to be a clean bill. It can't have these crazy conditions on it, such as building a border wall. Can I just mention one other thing that's a piece of positive news in Washington? I'm pleased to say that I passed my first major piece of legislation in Washington that had to do with career, technical, and vocational education. It's affectionately known as the Thompson-Krishnamurthi bill. It's the longest title bill in Congress, but essentially attacks the skills gap in this country. There's 6 million unfilled positions in the workforce, and it's mainly because employers can't locate the skills among folks to fill those positions. So what this bill does is it equips our young people and people in career transition with a credential, a certification, or a skill set after high school to be able to get a job. And it basically means that even though, a four-year college or university degree may not be for everyone, an education must be for everyone. And I'm pleased to say it passed not only with bipartisan support, but unanimously through the House. That never happened.
I was just going to say, yes.
Against these states. Never. And so it's a glimmer of hope for what can happen when good people on both sides focus on substantive issues and try to move working families forward. And so I'm just so pleased with that. We have the hard work of getting it through the Senate, and then obviously we need President Trump to sign it. But in my humble opinion, it can really change our economic trajectory as a country for the better and significantly if we can get this bill passed. It has support, like I said, all across the spectrum, management and labor, It has support from obviously Democrats, Republicans, and in our city, Sox and Cubs fans.
Well, we will be watching the progress of this in the United States Senate. Raja Krishnamorthi, Congressman from Schaumburg, Democrat, 8th District. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Hey, thanks.